panel, and this event, which is part of the European Union's Commission project, which this great consortium has been involved in, the Carnegie Europe Foundation. The title, it may be a bit off-putting, the original title, which we were working on for 2 years, is the European Union's limited statehood and contested orders. And as part of this, we are holding a special event today, and it's really quite novel. It's looking at the whole impact of Corona on governance. And the governance, we have seen the clash between the Corona, dealing with Corona and bad governance, whether it's in Belarus, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Iran. And I must stress that although the project that we're working on is specifically linked to the European Union's eastern regions, Ukraine and Belarus and other countries, and the southern regions, North Africa, Egypt, Libya, those in Iraq, naturally good governance actually affects democracies as well, which is why we have a stellar lineup. We have Rachel Kleinfeld coming from the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. Rachel, great to see you. Rachel is a great expert on governance and all things accountability, polarization, what keeps society stable, not stable, how to have inclusive democracies. We have Cornelius Adebahr. If you don't know him, you should know him, and you should read his book on Iran. Cornelius was based in Iran for some time. He's a scholar, visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. Our office is based in Brussels. And we have Agnieszka Legucka, no stranger to EU-LISTCO. Agnieszka is based in Warsaw with the Polish Institute of International Affairs, a great think tank. And Agnieszka is a great expert on Eastern Europe, Ukraine particularly. And there's myself. I'm the moderator who keeps everybody hopefully engaged. I'm based in Berlin. My name is Judy Dempsey. I've been working on Eastern Europe for many years, and also I was based in the Middle East, and now I'm back in Berlin. And a very warm welcome to you all. So here we go. The title of today's venue, which is only 1 hour, is Improving Governance After the Pandemic. Let's hope there will be an after, and the role of the transatlantic relationship. And we've seen how the transatlantic relationship has been rather rocky under the outgoing administration, especially with regard to cooperation in our eastern neighborhoods and southern neighborhoods. Cornelius, after the pandemic, transatlantic relationship, dealing with good governance, where do you begin, especially your neck of the woods, Iran and parts of the Middle East?
Thank you, Judy. Thank you to my dear fellow panelists, Agnieszka and Rachel, and thanks for everyone online who's tuned into this session. Good question. Where do we actually start? I take it that we'll work along the LISTCO crescent, if I can say. I'll start out in the south. We'll hear from Agnieszka in the east, and then over the Atlantic to Rachel. So obviously, Iran as the southern tip of the southern neighborhood, I can say, of the European Union is very much a question these days with the incoming US administration. High hopes have been placed on this particular policy field, that the handover in the White House, if and when it takes place in January, will also lead to a fundamental change in US policy. By the way, the second change in US policy within 4 years, because there was already transatlantic unity up until 2016, when the nuclear deal was signed. And the hope is that one can return not to the deal so much, that would be just an interim step, but more broadly to transatlantic coordination. And this starts with a nuclear file, but it doesn't end there, because ultimately also Iran is the governance issue. Whether you look at the country itself, how it is governed, or whether you look at how the Iranian leadership extends itself into areas of limited statehood and contested orders in the neighborhood. Look at Iraq, look at Syria, even the conflict in the South Caucasus, definitely a region of the European neighborhood. But the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan has also affected Iran in various ways, because of a distinct Azeri minority in Iran. The neighboring regions are even called Azerbaijan province inside Iran. So it is also this type of looking at governance issues, not just taking state to state relations as a given, but looking at governance issues, looking at societal resilience, which is important, and which is something that this particular research project has tried to drive forward, and which the Europeans ought to bring into renewed transatlantic cooperation.
That's a great opening remarks, Cornelius. And the fact that you bring in the contested orders, so much is contested in whether it's the borders with Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia. We see this now. But also you can look at Iran's influence in Syria and what it's doing in other countries as well. And contestation is such a wide issue as well. Thank you very much for this, and we will feed into this idea of the transatlantic cooperation later on in the session. Agnieszka, Cornelius set a very high standard in terms of keeping to the time of 5.5 minutes.
I thought I was answering a question rather than going into my introductory, but here we go.
A great introduction, Cornelius. Thank you all for the invitation, and I will try to keep time. My broader perspective on this project is that EU-LISTCO was focused on two cases in the Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine and Georgia. And in this particular year, I discovered that actually more dramatic situation we have in Belarus and Armenia around, of course, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict that Cornelius was mentioning. And the first conclusion from that, from these processes that I can observe, that actually COVID-19, this pandemic, was a cause for many disturbance in this region, and also something that we had findings around the project, that without social trust, it's impossible to manage the good governance, because, for example, President of Belarus was saying that COVID it's a false news. He was recommending drinking vodka for this disease and everything else, and people started to undermine his position, because he, as a president of the Belarus, he's acting president for 26 years. And in this year, in August, many demonstration protests were after the falsification of during the presidential elections. And now we have a political crisis, and I would link it in somehow with the answer that Belarusian president did not make over the pandemic. And also what is going on in Azerbaijan and Armenia, there are some links also to this pandemic case, because the problems with this disease, with the pandemic in Azerbaijan, has brought some internal impulses for the authorities to start the war. Of course, we know that this war was prepared for many, many years, more than 30 years in this particular region. But yes, COVID was one of the factors that erupted to this crisis. And in my introduction, I would say that the question is, does the transatlantic relations can strengthen this state institution? I see that it can be again democracy highlight as an important value in the transatlantic relations. And I think that there will be also a strong influence, or maybe stronger influence, in the Eastern Partnership countries because of not only democracy, but also the stability for the European Union, and probably the bond between US new administration and the European Union as an institution, and also as a countries which are waiting for the improving relations. So I don't know if I have more time for me to say, or this.
You'll have plenty.
You'll have plenty. The first 5 minutes.
You'll have plenty of opportunities. Don't worry, Agnieszka. There's a lot of things you already raised. Don't worry. There'll be plenty of chance to come back to these important issues.
Okay, so I would say that would be my first input to
Super.
our discussion.
Rachel, good morning. Thank you for joining us. It's very early. You have a ton of stuff to do back home. Agnieszka raised the whole important idea of social trust, and the whole idea of trust was certainly a big issue over when the corona hit the United States. And I was wondering, this trust is so essential for actually giving democracy the ballast that it needs, and this push. I've got two questions for you related to the trust in your own country. Can it be rebuilt? And just as importantly, the trust between the European Union and the United States, it was pretty rocky, it was pretty weak over the past couple of years. Can that be rebuilt as well?
Well, wonderful questions. Thank you for having me here. It's just a huge pleasure. And I commend everyone, since Judy didn't do it at the beginning, her terrific piece on Hungary and Poland from just a few days ago, which I thought was just an amazing overview of what needs to happen. So as my family says, from your mouth to God's ears, or maybe to the EU's ears. So trust in America is at a really low point. It was at a low point before this election. We had a social trust index of about 17%. That's about the lowest historically in America ever. It's one of the lower numbers in the democratic world. And when you don't have trust, you don't have an immune system as a society to push back against conspiracy theories like QAnon, against people giving you false information, as we were just hearing in Poland about drinking vodka. We had our drinking Clorox. At least vodka won't immediately kill you. So it's a very deep issue. This election is not done. And I think one thing that Europeans have to understand is that even when Trump eventually leaves office, which I do think will happen, he will be a huge force in American politics. He is unlikely to disappear. And one of the things that he will continue to do is erode trust in our institutions and between different parts of our society. You've already seen that. If you look at the election returns, you have upwards of 70% of people who voted for Trump saying that this was a fraudulent election. We've never had anything like that. If you go back to the last really contested election we had, Bush v. Gore, you had 70% of both sides before the Supreme Court decided saying we can accept either of these men as our president. We accept the results of this process. Now, after a much less contested election, actually, if you look at the numbers, you're not seeing that. So huge problem. I think the other thing that Europe needs to realize as we move into how do we rebuild trust with Europe is that it's going to take a long time just to get people into their jobs. This is a slow transition. We haven't started our transition yet. And the last time we had a slow transition was Bush v. Gore. And there, what we found was that the number of people in Senate confirmed positions was immensely slowed. Now, you have more of a civil service in most European countries. We have 4,000 positions that are politically appointed. 1,200 of those need to be Senate confirmed. And that takes a long time. You have to fill out financial forms and get background checks and all that. 100 days into his presidency, not long before 9/11, Bush had 35 Senate confirmed officials, 35. Obama had 69. To give you a sense. And until you have those people, you can't really get the people trickling down. So what does that mean? This is not going to be a normal administration. You're not going to have these people in place. And even before this period, you had civil servants who kept doing their job while waiting for these political appointees. That has been hollowed out. We have an immense reduction in who is there in our civil service under President Trump. And so it's not going to be business as usual. Then if we have a runoff in Georgia and we still have McConnell as the head of our Senate, it's going to be very hard to get things done. We haven't had a president who didn't have his party in power for many, many, many presidents. And so usually you get a 2-year honeymoon, you get to push your people through, you get to get confirmations. It may not be like that. It's not looking like that. So what does that mean for policy with the EU? I'll sum up here. Most important priorities are going to be domestic. He's got to deal with COVID. He's got to deal with the economy. Tony Blinken is probably going to have foreign policy. He's a fluent French speaker. He grew up for part of his life in France. He is a very pro-EU individual, and he is going to make sure that our alliances are repaired. There's going to be a pro-democracy focus, but there's also going to be a focus on China. And if you look at the other major person within this mix, Julianne Smith, one of her recent articles was about Europe needs a China strategy. Just because Trump is gone doesn't mean that great power competition is gone. Americans really think that that is crucial to the future of our power. And there's going to be real tension, I think, between the EU creating a democracy agenda that works for it and its near abroad, and the Belaruses and Polands and Hungaries of the world, and how it deals with China. Because the issues of dealing with China for the EU alone are very, very difficult, of course. And so I'll stop with that. I'll leave with one note that I think anti-corruption will be a major theme of the democracy efforts in this administration. And that bodes better for dealing with some of the problems in the near abroad, because corruption might be an easier issue for the EU also to wrap itself around.
Super, Rachel. If only corruption was an easy issue for the EU, because it's within the EU as well. And we see exactly the abuse of the funds, particularly in Hungary and in Bulgaria. Everybody forgets about Bulgaria and Romania. I mean, the EU is not in very good shape, but we can't stop the clock. And you raise a lot of really good points. I think we can't have any illusions. It's going to take a long time for the administration to settle in, and there's going to be an awful lot of internal fighting, getting the confirmations. Therefore, Europe just can't sit back and wait. Cornelius, we have a big problem with Iran, and we have a big problem with contested orders. We have a serious problem with what's going to happen to the nuclear deal with Iran. It's all very well Tony Blinken getting in, but that might be good news for Macron, since he's a fluent French speaker. But we have to deal with Iran before Trump leaves, and the day after. Is there any way that the EU can sort of not wait for the confirmations, but still work for the incoming administration or like-minded interlocutors to protect the deal?
Well, there is, but let me just jump on two things that Rachel said in her succinct analysis before coming to the Iran question, because there are two things that I find noteworthy, especially for Europeans. The first is that obviously, Rachel, you mentioned that there is a contested order within the United States. The Europeans should be careful to not only see it outside of the EU's borders, in the neighborhood, maybe in the United States these days, but also to look inside their own countries and see how orders are contested, how populist movements are trying to find new ways to do politics. And so while this is, and Rachel is someone who came from the democracy promotion work in third countries and is now promoting democracy inside the United States, this is something that the Europeans would also have to, a step they, at least mentally, they would have to make, that democracy need not only be promoted abroad, but we actually have to work on this inside the country. So that is something that I would like to see. And the other part is that with the focus on China that the next administration will have regardless, it shows how different still policy approaches will be. Not that the European Union is so successful in its comprehensive approach in the sense of looking at governance, putting resilience at the center of the global strategy. All that is fine, but the EU always risks falling into the old habits of somehow, letting nation states, member states go for the real policy meat. So France doing something in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Libya, etc. Even Iran, with the case of France, United Kingdom and Germany as the E3 lead group, is in danger of being dealt with at the member state level only. I'm the first to admit that there were reasons for this, but this should not be the EU's modus operandi in the mid to long term. the European Union needs to find its own strategies, and this will be probably strategies which are often different than the United States as a unitary state, great power actor. So there will be these kind of clashes. And the more we look into the neighborhood, the more I would like to see the EU taking the lead with this more granular approach, looking at statehood, contested orders, but with the backing from the United States. So in a perfect world, Washington would give a green light to how the European Union deals with the neighborhood, with European instruments, but would provide some political and material backing to it. That's not how it would work on Iran, though. And I'm sorry, Judy, I need to answer that. That's not how it will work with Iran. What the Europeans can do here is prepare the ground over the next 2 months, 2-3 months probably, until someone in the State Department is working and functioning in the new State Department, so that we can see over what is then the first half of 2021 some kind of an interim agreement, some call it a compliance for compliance deal, where simply both sides agree to go back to to the status quo ante, to the JCPOA, to the nuclear deal. But they would do so with a view to then eventually entering longer term negotiations. The difficulty is doing this between the inauguration on January 20th and the incoming new US administration and the Iranian presidential election on June 18th. So just 5 months later. That's a short window of opportunity, but this is where the Europeans can be most useful in preparing the ground for this.
Thanks, Cornelius. And I want to bring in Agnieszka, but I'd like to pick up one of your points, Cornelius, which also feeds into Rachel's. Inclusive democracy, Corona has actually exposed the lack of inclusive democracy inside the EU. And the executive is calling most of the shots in most of these countries. And there's now a backlash taking place in Germany. It's been building up, even by some of the established parties. Has Corona actually been good to actually not so much test the limits of democracy, but question the old ways of doing decision-making?
Okay, thank you. But also I would like to refer to some ideas that gave Rachel, if I may, especially when it comes to, I don't know if it's just this one sentence, but I would be aware not to compare Poland, Hungary, and Belarus. Not because that we cannot complain on the level of democracies in those two countries, and what you wrote, Judy, on your article, that those countries are blackmailing the European budget, and I would rather see it as also negotiating, rule of power within European Union. But I would not compare it those two countries to Belarus, because the horrible things are going on in Belarus, and almost 30,000 people who were protesting in a peaceful demonstration. Now they are arrested. Now we have political prisoners killing people by the regime. And it's, there was also one sentence that Biden did during his campaign, that he compared Poland to Hungary. And I remember the huge disappointment in polls that, come on, we are not like Lukashenko. Yes, we can complain all the things, that rule of law, the justice system. And I would also make a further argument, what you are pointing out, Judy, that the executive power, and it's not only the case of Poland and Hungary, but I suppose many countries within European Union are trying to use the opportunity of pandemia to strengthen the executive power, taking it from civil society, because you cannot protest because you can get some disease, and then it's step by step limits the democracy and limits the people voice, which is very important in the European Union, in democracy, and also in neighborhood. And I would say also, when we can broadly say when it comes to the East Europe, I would say that there is a process, on one hand, taking the authorities of the executive from juridical system, but also the level of corruption of juridical system is very high. And you can observe it comparing what President Ukraine Zelensky was trying to fight with the corruption, but in front of him was the jurisdiction, the constitutional court of Ukraine. And you need to also remember that some politicians and some elites, oligarchs perhaps, are pushing back the reforms which are even political parties, even political leaders are trying to impose.
Okay, Agnieszka, let's get one thing straight. We would never compare what's happening in Poland and Hungary to Belarus. This is truly appalling every single day, how these brave people are tortured, detained, intimidated. And there's areas of Minsk where the authorities, the regime has switched off the water and the heating. It is very, very cruel. This is seriously cruel. And I'm incredibly disappointed with the reaction by the European Union. This is another part of this discussion, perhaps. But, and Rachel would never suggest that there's a linkage in this. But I think, Rachel's position is about governance. And the EU is still such an attraction, but if we can't get our own internal governance right in terms of values, in terms of protecting the rule of law, it'll be a great disappointment for reformers and indeed Democrats on both sides of the Atlantic, outside the EU and in the United States as well. And at this point, I'd like to bring in Rachel, because she mentioned there's going to be a long time lag. Rachel, I have to throw this question to you. The European Union can't just sit and wait. In practical terms, we've got our internal problems and we have our eastern and southern neighborhoods. Is there any kind of a suggestion or proposal that you have in mind that we could actually run with before the administration is fully in place?
Well, first, let me also say that I did not mean to compare these countries for all the reasons that Judy just said. 5 minutes gets a little scary when you're a speaker, and so you start smushing sentences together. What can the EU do? Well, first, I think the EU has to act. As Cornelius was saying, waiting for America is not the right strategy. And in fact, I think with the Biden administration, they will welcome action. They would love, I believe, to have the EU come and say, look, we need you to back us up as we do X on Hungary and Poland to break this deadlock in the funds moving, or to move the rule of law forward. We would like you to support us in Y way, or what have you. I think that would be very welcome in the US to come in that direction with ideas. I think, as Cornelius was saying, there needs to be more of a linkage between democracy internally and democracy externally, and making that very clear. Some of that is things like Britain, which hasn't come up here, has very strong efforts to deal with freedom of speech overseas, to support reporters. These are on the front lines in places like Belarus. But its libel laws internally create a real quagmire for people who happen to be speaking about something in Britain to get caught up in and then get nabbed. Similarly, anti-corruption work overseas doesn't always match up with the ability to launder money through the United States, through Britain, through other countries that have major financial hubs. And so cleaning up internally and connecting that with our democracy work externally, I think is really, really important. For the EU itself, I think tying economics, which it has such a large hand on, to democracy is going to be crucial. We're going to exit this coronavirus with a large group of people who had just become middle class or who had started getting comfortable being in the lower middle class, suddenly finding themselves not in that position anymore. And as we learned in the 1930s, that is a very difficult moment for democracy. To have large groups of people who are slipping backward is a recipe for extremist politics within our own countries. It's a recipe for extremist politics in other countries. Social science says that we also have a different kind of extremism that comes when economies start rising up, but many people are rising much faster than people at the bottom. That creates another danger point. And that's exactly what we're likely to see as coronavirus lifts, that the people who have jobs like ours where we appear on Zoom, we're going to be fine and get better, and others are going to be growing here. So I think we're going to see quite a lot of extremist politics, and the best way out of that is through monetary support. And we know a lot about monetary support now. We know, for instance, that providing support to people directly, just giving them money, is actually a more useful strategy in many cases than filtering that money through many layers of middleman. We do that for the poorest of the poor. It's likely to work even better for people who don't have so many hits against them, who are in the lower middle class simply because the virus knocked out this set of jobs. So I think that you taking some experiments, looking at things like living allowances to help, not just help economically, but to help democratically stave off this kind of extremist politics would be really useful.
It's very important to give the social human dimension, because we tend to forget some of these things in sort of the geostrategic debates. But this is actually crucial for the day after Corona. And I was wondering, the three of you, if I could throw this question out to you, Rachel mentioned that Corona will, if we don't deal with the human element, it will be fodder for populists and for even more polarization. But is there another side to Corona, that it may actually strengthen civil society and democracy in a way that says we can't go back to the old business as usual, the old legislative executive structures? Is there, in terms of statehood and contested orders and democracy as part of this, will Corona bring about something new to democracy? Cornelius, would you like to take this on?
Yeah, I can start, but I'm certainly not the only one to speak to this. I guess it depends very much on how long Corona will last, to be very honest. I do recall, and it's not so long ago, it was just this spring, the first weeks of lockdown, that people who think about politics in a professional sense, some of them were very optimistic how much this could lead to a reversal of, as you said, the status quo, the old way of doing things. And lockdown was fairly short in the spring, and by the summer everyone thought this is over, and there was no change in politics. And what you did see is that there was as much resurgence of civic activism, but there was also this resentment which came out to the fore, and the conspiracy theories, and how much even the mandated mask is like a dictatorship to some. So I guess there was on both sides there was increased awareness and increased involvement. And now we're entering the second lockdown, at least here in Europe, and we don't know where we will be in the spring. That said, there is obviously the potential, yes. And there is so much that one can see in this pandemic of how the old ways don't work anymore. I mean, from the origins of the pandemic, I mean, the humankind intruding far too much into nature, and now attracting possibly further viruses, to how societies are organized, how governments are unable to tackle this, how short-sighted governments often acted. And so then ending, not ending, I would say, with how the urgency of climate change, how this is painted in stark pictures. If governments can act so quickly on a virus, why can't they do something on time? So this is a broad field, but what I do think is that the stronger already now the tendency is to go for this kind of civic engagement during the pandemic. The likelier is an outcome which we would like to see as a revived citizenship, resilient societies, and governments which have a new way of working.
Cornelius and Agnieszka and Rachel can chip in here. Aren't we getting at something very fundamental? Communication.
You mean communication from the government to the
leaders? I mean, inclusiveness is also about giving the opportunity for activists, NGOs, even those who oppose the lockdown. Listen to them, communicate with them, and my fear is that we're going to fall into the trap of how we deal with populists, that we demonize anybody who's against the status quo. And if you demonize, you create a certain level of legitimation. And one thing I find really interesting is this kind of lack of communication or mixed messages by various governments inside the EU, and zero communication in Russia, and very little in Ukraine. Well, we know about Belarus. The communication is the people. Romania doesn't communicate. Hungary doesn't communicate. They just accuse the EU of being a diktat. But isn't there something fundamentally lacking here with Corona when it comes to governance? It's really about reaching out and explaining and listening and involving.
Yeah, exactly. If I may add something what Cornelius said, I would say that after the pandemic, or the pandemic was a check test for authorities and leaders. And actually, when positive message is that people started to see that see the process and leadership as an important factor, because in Georgia, the first wave on pandemic was pretty much well organized, and that's why the ruling elite stay in power during these elections, right? So, and the next thing is Ukraine, when President Zelensky was messing up the communication. On one side, he was saying that he will close the border, then he will not close the border, and people was so they lived in uncertainty of many information and many communicates. And in that sense, the local elections few weeks ago or a week ago, Zelensky and his party lost in this local election. Yeah. Then now we have Maya Sandu in Moldova, when you have pro-European politician, because of the coronavirus crisis was not well organized, well managed by the previous authorities. And actually, I suppose that in Poland, and also, I don't know if it's Hungary, but Poland is, and probably US, the same thing. We have never had such a polarized society. Yeah. And the messages and communication from leaders, on one hand, they are mixed, but on other hand, the one side is accepting, one side of society accepting the leadership communication, and another is trying to undermine that kind of messages. And inside that in that kind of society, it's very hard to build trust and to build the democracy as we know, as a representative political system, from people. So this environment will give us very on that scenario, bad scenario. And I will follow up the Rachel idea that inequality that we will see in the future post-pandemic world will bring the same polarization or even stronger polarization in our societies, and no matter if it will be neighborhood or European Union societies.
I mean, thank you, Agnieszka, for these very important points. I mean, the polarization is just, it's not confined to the EU. It's nearly worldwide, wherever they are. One good point, we need some good news. One part of good news and one question. The good news is that in the local elections in Brazil, Bolsonaro's party was completely wiped out. And the local elections, the opposition ran, which feeds into Cornelius's point, they ran on two issues. One was the inability to deal with the pandemic. So this was a real criticism of the government. But interesting, they regard the Amazon as their heritage. And it was a real pro-climate issue. So this is the good news. You know, societies are not static. Now, maybe Rachel could come in here. Cornelius raised a really interesting point. Oh, you were really rushing ahead with the vaccine. Why can't we give priority to the climate as well? I think they will feed into each other inevitably, and it's happening in some countries. Rachel, we have a situation of complete polarization over climate change, complete polarization over how to distribute the vaccine, and a shocking, dangerous polarization. Actually, for America to be better again, surely this is going to be Biden's big task in trying to heal this, even though already the Republicans are looking towards 2024.
Yes, I think you're right. That polarization, as we've all been discussing, really, it's this invidious force that gets into our countries and then becomes extremely hard to get out, because when populists come in, one of the first things that becomes polarized is democracy itself. Populists attack democratic institutions because they get in the way of populists enacting their plans directly and speaking directly to the people, and then enacting directly their plans. All of our anti-majoritarian checks and balances in democracies, our courts and so on, stand in the way of a populist agenda. And so populists have to attack those institutions of democracy, and you see that all over the world. And what that means is that the other side supports those institutions of democracy, which makes democracy itself part of the polarized divide in every country. And that becomes incredibly difficult to unravel. And we see that in America now. We saw that in Poland with the courts, and really everywhere. And as you said, one of the ways to take it back is a real repudiation at the local level. Brazilians did much better than Americans at that. And so I think when you don't have that repudiation at the local level, when that polarization remains at the local level, and I think in America that has a lot to do with what we call geographic sorting, that our politics, we're not just polarized along a partisan line, we're polarized geographically, we're polarized in religious, ethnic, racial terms. It's one of the most polarized in the world. When you have all those forms of polarization, where you start to kind of chip away is really difficult. What I found in my last book is that rebuilding trust does happen at the local level, where there's already a little bit more trust in America as well as in many other places. And it starts with human contact, but it also starts with structural change. And there's a lot of talk about, well, if you can just get the sides together and they talk with each other and they understand their humanity, things will be better. But if the structural incentives for politics are still to continue polarizing, because that's how you raise money, that's how you get votes, that human level doesn't matter. We're too tribalized at this point in America. And that's what you see in other places with what's called affective polarization, where you dislike the other side more than you even like your side. You're scared of the other side. So we need that human contact, but we also need the structural changes to our politics that can happen sometimes better at the local level. Things that move away from first past the post elections, things that allow for broader representation, things that enable politicians who aren't quite so beholden to that polarizing duopoly to come forward. So I think that the solution set that Biden will have to play with, if he doesn't have a majority in the Senate, it's going to be pretty thin, because he won't be able to change those structural characteristics at the federal level. And it'll really be up to citizens. And I'll come back to your point here and then end on the social contract and citizens coming together. I think the one really positive thing about the coronavirus is that in many countries where citizens had started to form very official NGOs that weren't really connected to membership bases, or membership-based NGOs that weren't really connected to official politics, those lines have become much more blurry. And so you now have nonprofit organizations that know how to work political systems, but also have membership bases. They've started serving people. They've started to show that they can help with getting PPE out to people, getting masks and so on, and sanitizer delivered. And it's created a role for them. And hopefully that can translate into people moving at the local level, some of these democratic reforms that we need to see, so that you can see the polarization start to unravel.
I think the local level is crucial, whether we're talking about the European Union countries or the United States, or in the southern regions or the eastern neighborhoods of Europe. But what really disturbs me about this polarization is the lack of the center. The center still holds in Germany and in some other EU countries, and maybe the center is trying to claw back in some countries in Eastern Europe. But the center is about protecting statehood in a positive sense, and the center mitigates against everything being contested. But with the polarization and there's so little means available, can the center ground be built in these countries, whether it's in the EU or whether it's outside in the EU neighborhoods? There's very little evidence of it at the moment. Where do you begin? I agree, Rachel, with you, by the way. The local level is just so important. And we've seen it here when Angela Merkel opened the doors to 1 million refugees. The local help was extraordinary. And with the corona, I mean, our neighborhood, we all help, well, we help each other. We keep an eye out on each other. And it's a reflex, but it does raise questions, you know, what are the local governments doing, frankly? Because in some ways, the self-help is the center ground. And I'm just wondering, will the center ground be the tool to break this polarization, regardless of what kind of democratic system or non-democratic system we live in?
If I can jump in with just one comment and then turn it over to Cornelius, or shall we continue going around?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that it's important to separate the affective polarization from different policy views, because what we have in America, as well as in many other countries, is actually a very large center on policy agreement. You can get upwards of 60–70% of people agreeing on abortion, gun rights, all sorts of very contested issues, immigration even. But those policy views can't translate into policy because of the polarization, the real hatred and disgust that people feel toward the other side and that politicians exploit. So there's a real separation there, and you could still build on that central policy agreement if you could get the politics to function so that those weren't wedge issues that got out their extremist bases, but were issues on which you could resolve, and then that would take issues off the table. But if you take issues off the table, it doesn't help the politicians who are trying to actually keep those issues on the table so that they can keep running with them. I'll turn it back over to Cornelius.
Thank you, Rachel. And just, you know, building on what you've just said, I find it fascinating how in a discussion which ought to be on foreign policy, we discuss so many issues that relate to our own constituency, our own countries, and it just highlights how much foreign policy will also have to take these issues into consideration. So, I mean, how much does the European Union care about local governments in third countries? There is a bit when it comes to the enlargement process, because this is a very structured process of the EU basically going deep into the countries, into the social, the economic, the political systems of these countries and asking them to reform. But this is not the case for the neighborhood policy, which is one step further apart. But one of the allegations that always or often comes from third countries towards the European Union is that of double standards. And here we are. We ought to do our own stuff, and especially when it comes to enlargement, countries have things to do and obligations as long as they want to become a member. But once they are in, yeah, well, they can behave like the elephant in the China shop, not naming a single country. That's just, you know, one observation. The second, because I also would like to share some good news that you've alluded to, Judy, when it comes to the center and new formats of policy deliberations. There is something called the Citizens' Council. The most prominent example, I believe, in Europe at least, was the Irish example of reforms to abortion and to same-sex marriage being brought into the political discourse through citizens' councils. And there has been the Climate Council that President Macron in France initiated for specific reasons. And next year, early next year, Germany will hold a Citizens' Council on foreign policy, on Germany's role in the world, which was asked for by the federal parliament, by the Bundestag, and which will be conducted online, obviously. And this is something which can help form a center. What do citizens, if they are asked to deliberate on this particular issue for a couple of days, so more than just a poll being taken, what do they think of Germany's role in the world, and how does that inform official foreign policy making? That's the second step. But the first step is to gauge these citizen sentiments and form the center rather.
Yeah. It's Cornelius and Agnieszka and Rachel, we have a question here to everyone. Question from the audience. Elisa Shea, who is with the Free University here in Berlin. Here's our question. With anti-corruption as a potential US foreign policy priority, what potential means or mechanisms do you see for US-EU cooperation here to increase the likelihood of implementation of reform in Ukraine or elsewhere? That's I think that's up to you, Agnieszka. I must say the IMF and the EU have worked really well on the corruption issue in Ukraine, but over to you, Agnieszka.
Yeah,
and just to remind you that we have 8 minutes left. And
okay, so very quickly,
in the US.
I would not say that it should particularly change from the policy that we remember, because let's say that European Union was like soft power actor when it comes to the anti-corruption reforms, and also the positive message decentralization in Ukraine. That will bring a huge change in this country. And US was always like hard power, meaning when it comes was pushing for the reforms, negotiating bilaterally with the authorities. And I would hope that US will bring this issue again on the format of cooperating with the European Union towards Ukraine and any other country. I would suggest that this would be a very good step and very good path for Ukraine and other countries as well.
Cornelius, you want to jump in here?
Yes, just quickly, because it's a key question. It's very much it's not so fancy, I would say, as transatlantic cooperation on big ticket items, but it's crucial if Europe and the United States could align their anti-corruption policies, for example, by integrating it into provisions for how the State Department disperses money, or how development aid is being dispersed, and so. That's sounds very technical, but it can be very impactful. And the other element here is just to look at what are called kleptocratic networks. We have a huge issue inside EU member states, in some of them, but I mean, now we're talking about the neighborhood. These are, as we say, areas of limited statehood, and there are people making money off the status quo. And these are people that on a good day sit in government office, and in the evening of that same day, they run their kleptocratic business, or they do it while they're in government office. So the people that the European Union member states, the United States has to deal with, they are part of a money-making exercise in some of these countries, and they have no interest in reforming and political reforms, everything that the European Union prescribes, that they can, superficially tick the box maybe by passing some legislation, but they won't go down. They won't go into the details because this is against their interest, their professional or their business interest. And opening up towards this and having an honest conversation would be a good starting point for the EU and the US to address these kleptocratic networks in the European neighborhood, because that's what keeps these countries, from going actually into a direction of political reform.
But Cornelius, there are these networks in London. There are these networks in parts of Germany, and the EU has to deal with them. And the US has been quite firm on these elements of sharing information and so on. In fact, much more aggressively so than the European Union member states, whether it's buying passports or dumping your money or buying property, hiding behind all of this. I mean, Europe is quite corrupt, and as you say, it's pretty good at double standards.
Unfortunately, yes, and it could use probably a prod from Washington when it comes to
a big prod. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think your points are very well taken, and I think the other problem that we're going to have with the EU dealing with this is that now two of the states that are really quite problematic, Switzerland and London City, are going to be outside the EU. Switzerland for a long time, and England now, or in the near future. And so the EU is losing clout, although maybe gaining some, and that with them outside the EU, it can wag a finger rather than dealing with the internal policies toward them. And I recognize that they'll both have special relationships, but and clearly they're not alone in the problems within the EU. But I think you're right that the US under Biden will go back to its previous situation, I think, where it's trying to unravel these. It's using DOJ authorities quite strongly to find these kleptocratic networks and pull them out. I think we will have to avoid the EU allowing people to slide by. In my last book, I wrote about this. I had a 2-year-old at the time, and I was thinking of her when I wrote that what happens with these kleptocrats who are in their offices by day is you see them building up a block tower, and they'll let that block tower get so high so that it doesn't threaten them, but it looks like you're building a pretty good tower against the corruption, but not get too high. If it gets too close to them, it just gets knocked down. And that's what you see, and it's really easy for those who wish to say, oh, look, the blocks are being put in place, and not really unravel the networks if they don't want to. And so I think getting into that and accepting that we're going to have to is quite important. And it plays into foreign policy, of course, because these kleptocratic networks span into some of the great power problems that we're facing.
Yeah, Rachel, I think you're completely right. And if the public see that corruption has been tackled, whether it's in Hungary or whether it's in Ukraine or Romania or Bulgaria or in EU member states, I think it's good news for democracy, frankly. It's good news for trust, because if those who spread the corruption and are involved in the corruption and take bribes and insist on bribes, or else go on to much higher degrees of corruption, which Cornelius and you were alluding to, the whole trust in the democratic institutions weakens. And on this very happy, optimistic note, I'm afraid we've come to the end of this discussion on limited statehood, and limited statehood is about actually not combating corruption and dealing with the whole idea of governance post-corona. Hopefully one day there will be a post-corona, we can all meet again. Thank you very much, Rachel Kleinfeld, Cornelius Adebahr, and Agnieszka Legucka. Keep safe, and bye-bye, everybody. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the audience. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you all. Take care.